And a warning that the summer of devastating wildfires underlines the need for radical shifts in behaviour to tackle global warming. Now, the Greek Prime Minister says a string of devastating wildfires this summer has underlined the need for radical shifts in behaviour to tackle global warming. Fires have torn through several Mediterranean countries, including Greece, Turkey, Spain and Italy. And Russia has been battling its own record-breaking fire season. Courtney Bembridge has this report.
This was the scene facing firefighters in central Russia, a wall of flames which had them quickly surrounded.
The flames were rising up to 30 to 40 meters. It was absolutely horrible. The wind was whooshing, blazing pieces of wood were flying around just 100 to 150 meters away. It was a storm of a fire, a storm of ashes and smoke.
This is Russia's second worst fire season since the turn of the century. Fuelled by extreme heat, they've burned through more than 17 million hectares of land. Experts say climate change has made the country's huge expanses of forest drier, hotter and increasingly vulnerable to wildfires. Europe has also hit record temperatures this summer and wildfires have torn through the Mediterranean. The Greek Prime Minister described it as the bitter cost of climate change.
We recognise that dealing with the climate crisis is forcing us to change everything. The way we produce agricultural products, how we move around, how we generate energy and the way we build our homes. Everything must change in this immense effort to mitigate the impact of the climate crisis to whatever extent possible.
Scientists say last year was the warmest on record across Europe, exceeding the previous record by a considerable amount. And they're again calling for action, with a crucial moment on the horizon. Leaders from almost 200 countries will meet in Glasgow in November for a major climate conference, described as the world's last best chance to tackle climate change. Courtney Bembridge, BBC News.
Well, according to a new climate report, last year was the warmest on record across Europe. Temperatures around the region were more than 1.9 degrees Celsius above the long-term average between 1981 and 2010. The State of the Climate 2020 report from the American Meteorological Society says temperatures in the Arctic are also rising rapidly, with temperatures over land the highest since records began in 1900. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by Professor Will Stephan. He is an expert on climate change and a researcher from the Climate Council of Australia. Professor Stephan, thank you very much for being with us. We heard some rather worrying figures there, but how concerned should we be by this report's findings?
I think we should be very concerned because this is ultimately driven by a very long-term trend in the climate system, driven primarily by the emission of fossil fuels. And unfortunately, about 2 decades of worsening weather are already baked into the system from past emissions. So this is telling us two things. We have to be prepared and deal with worse impacts for some time into the future, and we must act now if we want to have any chance of stabilizing the climate system by mid-century.
Can we say that all of the extreme weather events we've seen over the last few months are related to climate change?
What we can say, I think, with a high degree of probability is that it is extremely unlikely that these would have occurred without climate change. In other words, you can look at long-term observational records in Europe, around the world, and so on, and see how often events like this happen. What we see now are these events are not only occurring far more frequently, they're becoming more extreme. Extreme heat has higher temperatures, more area of fires are burning, extreme rainfall is becoming even more intense. And the only plausible explanation is the fact that climate change is driving this change in extreme weather.
The report looked at the whole world, but are there any geographical areas or regions that were of particular concern or are particularly disproportionately affected by climate change?
Yes, that's a very good point. I think the northern high latitudes are one we really have to watch. Temperatures rising about twice as fast as the global average. That's being borne out now by the massive fires in Russia. We're starting to see some melting of permafrost. The Greenland ice sheet is now losing ice at an accelerating rate. So this is really a so-called hotspot in the Earth system because what changes in the northern high latitudes is going to reverberate around the planet via sea level rise and so on.
Later on this year, we have the latest COP meeting planned in Glasgow in Scotland. What can the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change do in response to this data?
Well, look, I think we need to put it on the table to the world's leaders that this really is the last best chance to get on a pathway that will stabilize the climate within the Paris climate goals. And that means that countries have to focus on near-term climate goals, that is 2030, rather than 2050. If we don't have emissions headed downwards strongly by 2030, we will not have a chance of stabilizing the climate within the Paris goals.
OK, Professor Will Steffen from the Climate Council of Australia. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much for making the time for us.
Thank you. My pleasure.